Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Wildlife tracking work has a way of making you feel like you're reading a language that most people don't know exists. You learn to see the landscape the way the animals see it, through the logic of food and water and cover and threat, and after enough time in the field, you develop an instinct for why a herd goes where it goes, and why a predator holds a certain territory, and why certain sections of habitat get used heavily while others sit empty. Most of the time, the landscape's logic is readable, the animals doing what animals do for reasons that ecology explains cleanly. The valley gave me a sentence I couldn't read for most of a season before I understood what it was saying. And by the time I understood it, I had already ignored it twice, which is the part I have the hardest time sitting with. The organization I worked for ran long-term population monitoring programs across several wilderness areas in the northern Rockies, and the Montana Valley contract was a single-season assessment, building a baseline dataset on the wildlife community in an area that had been proposed as a conservation corridor connecting two larger protected areas. My job was to spend the season tracking the valley's major species, mapping their ranges and movement patterns and habitat use, and producing a report that would inform the corridor planning. Standard work, the kind I had done in 4 previous seasons in different locations, and the valley was a good one for it. A healthy and relatively undisturbed ecosystem with populations of most of the species you'd expect in that part of Montana. My field partner for the season was a man named Brandt, who had been doing wildlife research for a decade and who had the specific quality of intelligence that expresses itself in pattern recognition, the ability to look at a dataset and see the shape of it before the analysis is complete. He was the person I wanted beside me when the data started showing something I didn't understand, and he was beside me when it started showing exactly that. The gap appeared in the 3rd week of data collection, when I had enough tracking information from the valley's major species to start building a habitat use map. I was working through the GPS collar data from the elk herd we'd tagged on arrival, plotting the locations against the valley's terrain, and I noticed a section of the valley floor where the points simply stopped. Not a gradual reduction in activity toward the edges of the herd's range, a clean absence, a section of maybe half a mile across where not one location point appeared across 3 weeks of continuous tracking. I checked the terrain data for that section first, looking for the obvious explanation. Cliff face, water body, dense brush, some physical feature that would naturally exclude a large grazing herd. The terrain data showed open grassland, the same habitat the elk were using extensively in the surrounding areas. No physical barrier, good forage, no reason on the map for the herd to avoid it. I mentioned it to Brandt that evening, and he pulled up the data on his own laptop and spent about 20 minutes with it before he said that it was probably a predator's core use area, that wolves or a bear operating heavily in that section would push elk out of it reliably. He said we'd likely find heavy carnivore sign when we surveyed the section on foot. I said that was probably right, and we moved on, and I kept collecting data. By the end of the 5th week, I had enough information from all the species we were monitoring to see that the predator explanation didn't hold. The wolf pack we were tracking, a 7-animal group whose collars gave us detailed location data, was avoiding the same section of the valley floor as the elk. Wolves don't avoid areas because of bears in the pattern I was seeing, a clean circular boundary rather than the variable avoidance behavior that competition between predators produced. The bears we were monitoring weren't showing location points in the section either. I mapped the avoidance boundary from the combined dataset on a Friday afternoon, and Brant leaned over my shoulder and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. The boundary was consistent across every species in the dataset: elk, wolves, bears, deer, the smaller mammals whose activity we were tracking. Through camera traps rather than collars, the boundary showed up in all of it, a roughly circular edge that no animal in the valley crossed or approached. The precision of it was what made Brand go quiet. The way the boundary held its shape across species with completely different ecologies and movement patterns and threat responses, as if something had drawn a line in the valley and every living thing with working instincts had agreed to respect it. He said it didn't look like habitat avoidance. He said it looked like fear. I went into the avoided area the following Monday. I want to explain why I did that, because in retrospect, it reads as the obvious mistake, and at the time, it felt like the obvious next step. I was a field researcher with a gap in my data, and the most direct way to understand a gap was to go look at what was inside it. That was the logic, and the logic was sound, and I followed it. The section of valley floor that every animal in the ecosystem refused to enter was on foot and in full daylight, unremarkable in its appearance. Open grassland transitioning to sparse shrub cover toward the center, gentle terrain, no standing water, no features that distinguished it from the surrounding valley floor in any visual way. I walked in from the eastern edge and moved towards the center with my notebook and my camera and the particular alertness of someone doing field survey in carnivore country. The sound was the first thing I noticed, specifically the absence of it. The valley had a consistent ambient sound profile that I had been working in for 5 weeks and had stopped consciously registering the way you stop registering the sound of a refrigerator in a room you spend a lot of time in. Insects, birds, the wind through the grass, the particular acoustic texture of a healthy functioning ecosystem going about its business. Inside the boundary, the sound stopped. Not gradually. Within about 20 feet of the edge, it was simply gone. A silence that was so complete and so sudden that my ears adjusted to it the way they adjusted to a change in pressure, and I stood inside it for a while before I continued toward the center. No insects, no birds, not even the overhead passage of anything crossing above the section. The grass moved in the same wind that moved the grass outside the boundary, but produced no sound against my legs as I walked through it, which was the detail that bothered me most, and that I wrote in my field notes and underlined without knowing why I was underlining it. The depression was near the center, a roughly circular low point in the ground, maybe 15 feet across, shallow, the grass inside it slightly different in color from the surrounding growth, a difference subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking at the ground with survey attention. The depression was too regular for natural erosion, and too consistent in its depth across its full extent to be the result of random soil variation. Something had made it, or something had been in it long enough and consistently enough to compress the ground into the shape it held. I photographed it and measured it and wrote it up in my notes and walked back out of the avoided area. And the sound came back as I crossed the boundary, the insects and birds resuming so immediately and completely that the transition was jarring in a way that the entry hadn't been, because walking into silence is less of a shock than silence suddenly ending. I told Brant what I'd found, and he wanted to see it. We went back together the following Thursday, and I brought a small excavation kit because the depression had been in my head all week, and I wanted to understand whether the regularity was surface deep or whether it went further down. The wolves were at the boundary when we arrived. The full pack, all 7 animals, positioned along the eastern edge of the avoided section where we had entered the previous Monday, and they were vocalizing in a way that stopped both of us walking before we had fully processed what we were seeing. Not howling, not the territorial or communicative vocalizations I had been documenting all season. Something lower and more sustained, the kind of sound that wolf packs didn't make in my experience of them. They were making it while looking directly at us. Brand said, very quietly, that he had never seen wolves do that. I said I hadn't either. We stood there at the edge of the boundary, looking at the pack, and the pack looked back at us and made the sound that I didn't have a category for, and I understood with a certainty that I couldn't have defended in any professional context that the wolves were telling us something. Not in the anthropomorphized sense of animal communication that field researchers were trained to be skeptical of, but in the direct and physical sense of a warning delivered by animals whose entire evolutionary history had given them very good reasons to recognize things worth warning about. I had been inside the boundary twice. The wolves had never been inside it at all. We didn't go in that day. We stood at the edge and documented the pack's behavior, and then we walked back to the truck and drove to camp, and I spent the evening going back through 5 weeks of tracking data with the specific question of how long the avoidance had been operating, whether there was any early season data that showed animals near the boundary before the pattern solidified. There wasn't. The boundary showed up in the first week of data with the same precision it showed in the 5th week. The animals had known where the edge was before I had any data to show me it existed. The season ended 6 weeks later. The full dataset went into the corridor planning report, which documented the avoided area as an anomalous gap in habitat utilization that I characterized as requiring further ecological investigation before the corridor planning incorporated that section of the valley floor. It was the most conservative language I could find for something. I didn't have the professional vocabulary to describe accurately. Brant filed his own section of the report, and we had one conversation about what language to use before we agreed on conservative and moved on, which was the decision that the situation allowed us to make within the framework of what we were there to do. I've thought a lot about the wolves at the boundary in the time since. The 7 of them lined up along the edge in the particular morning light of that Thursday, making a sound I didn't have a name for, looking at the 2 humans who were about to walk into the one section of the valley that nothing else in the ecosystem would enter. They had been living alongside whatever was in that depression for as long as the pack had existed in that valley, which was at least the 4 years prior to our season based on the organization's historical records. Every generation of that pack had learned the boundary the way wolf packs learned every feature of their territory, thoroughly and completely, and with the kind of certainty that meant the knowledge had been tested. Whatever tested it had taught them where the line was, and on a Thursday morning in late summer, they stood at the line and told us not to cross it in the only language they had available, and we were smart enough that day to listen. I only regret that it took us until the second visit to understand what they'd been saying since the first.